In the glittering ballrooms of 1888 London, where whispers are currency, and a lady's reputation is her most fragile asset, a simple game can become a life sentence. For Lady Genevieve Ainsworth, a spirited debutante who believed society's rules were made to be bent, a foolish wager was meant to be a thrilling secret. The prize? A single waltz with the city's most formidable and untouchable man, Duke Caspian Thorn, a man rumoured to have ice in his veins and a fortune built on ruin. But she was about to learn that when you play games with a ruthless predator, you don't set the stakes. He does, and the price he demanded for one dance was her future, her freedom, and her name. The London season was a battlefield disguised in silk and satin. For the young ladies of the aristocracy, it was a campaign of strategic smiles, calculated curtsies, and the delicate art of being seen by the right gentleman. For Lady Genevieve Ainsworth, however, it was a grand theatrical game. With her sharp wit and/or a mischievous glint in her sapphire eyes, she found the endless parade of balls and soirees to be a source of private amusement rather than matrimonial anxiety. Her father, the Earl of Northwood, was a man whose primary concern was the preservation of his ancient lineage, a goal that now rested squarely on his daughter's slender shoulders. Genevieve, he would often sigh, his brow furrowed with the weight of expectation. A lady of your standing must be prudent. Your future and ours depends on a respectable match. Genevieve would simply smile and nod, the picture of filial obedience, while her mind danced with thoughts far more rebellious than her father could ever imagine. Her closest confidants were the Harrington twins, Beatrice and Cecilia, ladies whose appetite for gossip was matched only by their flair for the dramatic. It was in their lavishly decorated sitting room, surrounded by porcelain figurines and the scent of expensive perfume, that the fateful wager was born. "He was at the Danbury Gala last night," Beatrice whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. Duke Thorn. The name fell into the quiet room like a stone, sending ripples through the polite atmosphere. Duke Caspian Thorn, the Duke of Blackwood, was less a man and more a myth. He was obscenely wealthy, devastatingly handsome in a severe, unyielding way, and possessed a reputation so fearsome that mothers clutched their debutante daughters closer whenever he entered a room. He rarely appeared in society, but when he did, he moved through the glittering crowds like a panther, silent and observing, his cold grey eyes missing nothing. It was said he had destroyed his rivals in business without a shred of mercy, and had never once been seen to smile. "He didn't dance, of course," Cecilia added, fanning herself dramatically. "He merely stood by the French doors, looking as though he were contemplating which of the guests he would financially ruin first." Genevieve laughed, a bright, musical sound that was entirely at odds with the subject. "Oh, you two are ridiculous. He is just a man. A man who has never taken a partner for a waltz. Not once. In 5 seasons," Beatrice countered. "They call him the Iron Duke. They say his heart is as cold and empty as his ballroom at Thorne Manor." It was then that the spark of mischief in Genevieve's eyes ignited into a full-blown flame. The challenge was irresistible. The Iron Duke was the ultimate prize in their game of social conquests. "I wager," Genevieve began, leaning forward, her voice a conspiratorial whisper, "that he is not immune to a woman's charm. He simply hasn't met one bold enough to try." Cecilia gasped. "Genevieve, you wouldn't dare." "I would," she confirmed, a grin playing on her lips. "I wager this very locket," she said, touching the delicate gold piece at her throat, a gift from her late mother, "against Beatrice's pearl earrings, that I can not only speak to Duke Thorn, but I can make him dance." The twins stared at her, aghast. To approach the Duke was social suicide. To be rejected by him would be a humiliation from which a young lady might never recover. "Just a waltz," Genevieve pressed, her confidence soaring. "What harm can there be in one waltz? The man is not a monster." "They say he is," Beatrice said, her voice barely audible. "They say he devoured the previous duke's fortune and left his cousins with nothing but dust and debt. He is ruthless, Genevieve." But the warning was lost on her. In her youthful naivety, Genevieve saw only the thrill of the game. The fearsome Duke was the most difficult opponent she had ever faced, and the thought of winning, of being the only woman to ever lead the Iron Duke to the dance floor, was a victory too sweet to resist. The wager was sealed with a shared look of trepidation and excitement. The perfect opportunity was to be the upcoming masquerade ball at Beaumont House, the most anticipated event of the season. Behind the anonymity of a mask, she could be bolder, her actions less scrutinized. She spent the next week meticulously planning her strategy, choosing a gown of deep crimson that would stand out in a sea of pastels, and a delicate silver mask that concealed her identity, but not the determined sparkle in her eyes. To her, it was all a grand jest, a story she would one day laugh about with her friends. She had no way of knowing that she was not the one playing the game, but was merely a pawn in a much larger, more dangerous one, orchestrated by the very man she sought to conquer. Beaumont House was a vision of opulence, its grand ballroom illuminated by the light of 1,000 candles flickering in crystal chandeliers. The air hummed with the sound of the orchestra, the swish of silk gowns, and the low murmur of masked gossips. Genevieve moved through the throng, her crimson dress a slash of vibrant color against the pale golds and blues of the other guests. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that was a mixture of exhilarating fear and audacious resolve. She spotted him almost immediately. Duke Caspian Thorn stood alone near the shadowed colonnades lining the terrace, just as the twins had described. He was not dressed in the elaborate costumes of the other men, but in a perfectly tailored black evening suit, his only concession to the masquerade being a simple, unadorned black mask that did little to soften the harsh, aristocratic lines of his face. He held a glass of brandy, his posture rigid, his presence a vortex of cold power that seemed to repel the festive atmosphere around him. Taking a deep, fortifying breath, Genevieve began her approach. Her plan was not to be direct. A man like Thorn would dismiss a fawning debutante without a second thought. She needed to intrigue him, to present a puzzle he felt compelled to solve. She passed by him, seemingly on her way to the terrace, when she allowed her ornate silk fan to slip from her grasp, letting it clatter onto the marble floor, just inches from his polished shoes. She paused, turning with a soft, almost imperceptible sigh of frustration. For a long moment, he did nothing. He simply looked down at the fan, then his cool, grey eyes lifted to meet hers through the cutouts of their masks. Genevieve felt a jolt, a genuine shock of alarm at the intensity of his gaze. It was like being studied by a hawk, calculating, intelligent, and utterly devoid of warmth. Then, with a deliberate, almost unnervingly fluid grace, he bent down and retrieved the fan. He did not hand it back immediately. Instead, he held it, his gloved fingers tracing the delicate hand-painted birds on its surface. "A careless move, my lady," he said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, smoother than she had expected, yet laced with a dangerous edge. "Or a calculated one?" Genevieve's carefully prepared wit almost failed her. He had seen through her ploy instantly. She had to recover to match his directness. "A gentleman would assume the former," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her veins. but I am beginning to suspect I am not speaking to a mere gentleman. A flicker of something, was it amusement, respect, passed through his eyes. He stepped closer, and the crowd around them seemed to fade into a blur. You are correct. You are speaking to a man who has little time for such games. State your purpose. This was it. Her heart pounded. My purpose, Your Grace, is a dance, a waltz. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. She could feel the eyes of nearby guests on them, sensing the unprecedented nature of the scene unfolding. The Iron Duke, cornered by a mysterious lady in red. He studied her, his head tilted slightly. I do not dance. Everyone dances, Your Grace, she countered, emboldened by his continued engagement. Some simply haven't found the right partner. She expected a dismissal, a cold turn of his shoulder, the public humiliation she had been warned about. Instead, he extended his free hand. One waltz, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more commanding than a shout. But be warned, my lady, I always collect on my bargains. Before she could process his cryptic words, his hand was on her waist, and he was guiding her to the dance floor. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom as the Duke of Blackwood took a partner for the first time in memory. The orchestra began a new waltz, a haunting, melodic piece. Being in his arms was nothing like she had imagined. It was not a romantic fantasy. It was a terrifying, exhilarating capture. He held her with a firm, possessive strength, leading her through the steps with an expert precision that belied his claim of never dancing. He did not speak. He simply watched her, his grey eyes boring into hers, stripping away her mask, her confidence, her very soul. She felt like a butterfly pinned for display. The game was gone, replaced by a primal sense of danger. This was not a man one played with. This was a predator, and she had willingly stepped into his snare. The waltz felt both like an eternity and a fleeting second. When the final notes of the music faded, he did not release her immediately. His hand remained firmly on her waist, holding her in place in the center of the now silent ballroom. Every eye in the room was on them. You have your dance, he murmured, his voice for her ears alone, yet carrying the weight of a public decree. And now I will have my prize. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, a thick, expectant hush that pressed in on Genevieve from all sides. The orchestra was still, the dancers frozen, and every masked face was turned towards the couple standing in the center of the floor. Caspian Thorne's hand was still a possessive brand at her waist, his proximity overwhelming. Your prize, Your Grace, Genevieve managed to whisper, her throat suddenly dry. The game was over. She had won the wager. All he had to do was release her, and she could retreat into the crowd. But he did not release her. Instead, he raised his voice, not shouting, but pitching it with a chilling authority that carried to every corner of the vast room. For 5 seasons, he began, his gaze sweeping over the assembled aristocrats. I have found little in society to interest me. I have found the debutantes predictable, their ambitions transparent. His eyes returned to Genevieve, pinning her with their intensity. Until tonight. A nervous murmur rippled through the guests. Genevieve's blood ran cold. This was not part of the game. This was a public spectacle, and she was its unwilling centerpiece. He reached up and, with a swift, decisive movement, untied the silk ribbon of her mask. It fell away, revealing her face to the stunned assembly. Gasps of recognition echoed around the room. Lady Genevieve Ainsworth, the Earl of Northwood's daughter. Lady Genevieve was bold enough to seek a waltz, the Duke announced, his voice like chips of ice. A simple request, but one that revealed a spirit I have sought. She initiated a game, a bargain for a dance. He paused, letting the tension build to an unbearable peak. "And now, the terms of my payment are set." He turned her slightly to face the crowd, his arm a steel bar behind her back. "This lady has proven her worth. Therefore let it be known. For the price of one waltz, Lady Genevieve Ainsworth has agreed to become my bride." The world tilted on its axis. The collective shock in the room was a palpable force, a wave of disbelief and scandalized whispers. Genevieve stared at him, her mind reeling, unable to form a coherent thought. "No," she breathed, the word catching in her throat. "That was not the bargain." "It is now," he said, his voice a low, private threat. "You sought my attention in the most public way possible. Did you think I would not respond in kind? Smile, Lady Genevieve. Our peers are watching." His words were a splash of icy water. She understood now. This wasn't a whim. This was a calculated, strategic move. He had turned her foolish prank into a binding public declaration. To deny it now, to refute the word of a duke in front of the entirety of high society, would be catastrophic. She would be labelled a liar, a shameless manipulator. Her reputation would be in tatters, her family disgraced beyond repair. The Earl of Northwood would be ruined. She looked past the Duke's unyielding form and saw her father at the edge of the ballroom, his face pale with horror. She saw the Harrington twins huddled together, their expressions of shock mixed with a dawning, terrible understanding. They had witnessed the wager. They knew this was not a betrothal, but they would be too terrified of the Duke to ever speak the truth. She was utterly, completely trapped. He had woven a cage of rumor and expectation around her, and the door had just slammed shut. Forced to play her part, she summoned every ounce of her remaining strength and produced a fragile, trembling smile. The journey home in her family's carriage was a silent, torturous affair. The Earl of Northwood didn't speak, his face a mask of grim fury and humiliation. When they finally arrived at their townhouse on Eaton Square, he rounded on her in the foyer. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice shaking with rage. "Do you have any idea the position you have put me in? To be affianced to that man, it is unthinkable. But to refuse him now is impossible. He has made it so." "I didn't agree to this, father," Genevieve pleaded, tears finally streaming down her cheeks. "It was a game, a stupid wager." "A game?" her father scoffed, his face contorted in disbelief. "You played a game with Caspian Thorn? The man does not play, child. He conquers. You have bound yourself to him, and in doing so, you have bound this family. You will marry him. There is no other choice." The next morning, the official announcement was in every newspaper. The engagement of the season, the reclusive, ruthless Duke of Blackwood, and the Earl of Northwood's spirited daughter. Her friends sent letters, a mixture of congratulations and thinly veiled pity. But Genevieve knew the truth. She was not a celebrated bride-to-be. She was a prize, claimed in a cold, hostile takeover, destined for a life with a man she feared, a man who had turned her playful waltz into a dance of damnation. The wedding was a swift, perfunctory affair, devoid of any joy or celebration. It was held in a private chapel, attended only by a handful of reluctant witnesses. Genevieve stood at the altar in an ivory gown that felt more like a shroud, her face hidden behind a veil that did little to conceal her misery. Caspian stood beside her, a formidable statue of a man in dark, impeccable attire. He spoke his vows in a clear, steady voice, the words sounding more like the terms of a contract than a declaration of love. When it was her turn, Genevieve's voice was a choked whisper, the words, "I do," tasting like ash in her mouth. The kiss he gave her was as cold and brief as the ceremony itself, a mere brush of his lips against hers, a formal seal on their legal transaction. There was no wedding breakfast, no reception, no well wishes. Immediately after the signing of the register, she was whisked away into the Duke's austere black carriage, leaving her family and everything she had ever known behind. The journey to Thorne Manor was made in near total silence. Caspian sat opposite her, his grey eyes fixed on the passing landscape, his expression unreadable. He did not speak to her, did not offer a single word of comfort or explanation. He treated her as if she were merely another piece of cargo being transported to his estate. As dusk began to settle, they turned off the main road and onto a long, winding drive flanked by ancient, skeletal trees. And then Thorne Manor rose before them. It was not a home, it was a fortress, a vast, Gothic monolith of dark grey stone, with imposing turrets and narrow, slit-like windows that seemed to watch her like malevolent eyes. The house stood silhouetted against a bruised purple sky, radiating an aura of profound loneliness and sorrow. The carriage rolled to a halt before a massive oak door, which swung open as if by an unseen hand. A line of servants stood rigidly in the grand entrance hall, their faces as stony and unwelcoming as the house itself. The hall was a cavern of shadows, dominated by a sweeping marble staircase and walls lined with the portraits of stern-faced ancestors. The air was cold, still, and smelled faintly of dust and decay. At the head of the servants stood a tall, severe-looking woman in a black dress, her grey hair pulled back into a tight, unforgiving bun. Her expression was one of undisguised disapproval. "Your Grace," she said, her voice crisp and emotionless as she addressed Caspian, completely ignoring Genevieve. "Welcome home." "Mrs. Gable," Caspian acknowledged with a curt nod. "This is the Duchess. See that she is shown to her rooms." It was the first time he had referred to her by her new title, and it felt like a cruel mockery. He hadn't called her his wife. He had called her the Duchess, a position, not a person. Without another word to Genevieve, he turned and strode down a long, dark corridor, disappearing into the depths of the manor, leaving her alone with the hostile housekeeper. Mrs. Gable's cold eyes raked over Genevieve from head to toe. "This way, Your Grace," she said, the title dripping with thinly veiled contempt. She led Genevieve up the grand staircase and down a seemingly endless hallway. The silence of the house was unnerving, broken only by the echo of their footsteps on the cold stone floors. "These are the Duchess's chambers," Mrs. Gable announced, pushing open a heavy wooden door. "They are separate from the Duke's. His wing is in the East Tower and is strictly private." The rooms were opulent, filled with heavy, dark wood furniture, rich tapestries, and a massive canopied bed. But like the rest of the house, they were cold and utterly impersonal. A fire had been lit in the hearth, but it provided little warmth against the pervasive chill of the place. "The Duke dines alone. Your meals will be served here in your parlour," the housekeeper continued, her tone making it clear that this was not a suggestion, but a rule. "You are not to disturb him. Your duties as Duchess will be minimal. The running of this household is my domain." With that, she turned to leave. "Mrs. Gable," Genevieve called out, her voice stronger than she felt. The housekeeper paused, turning back with an impatient look. "Why does the Duke treat me this way?" Genevieve asked, the question that had been screaming in her mind for weeks. Why did he do this? A strange, almost pitying look crossed Mrs. Gable's harsh features for a fleeting moment. "The Duke does everything for a reason," she said cryptically. "You would be wise to remember that Thorne Manor has its own rules. Learn them, obey them, and do not ask questions. It will be easier for you that way." The door clicked shut, leaving Genevieve in the suffocating silence of her gilded cage. She walked over to the tall, mullioned window and looked out into the encroaching darkness. She was a prisoner here, a duchess in name only, married to a man who was a stranger and governed by a staff who despised her. The playful wager that had started it all seemed a lifetime ago, a foolish dream from a world that no longer existed. Here, in the cold heart of Thorne Manor, the real game had just begun, and the stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. The first few weeks at Thorne Manor were a lesson in isolation. Genevieve was a ghost in her own home, confined to her lavish but soulless suite of rooms. True to Mrs. Gable's word, her meals were delivered on silent feet by a timid maid who refused to meet her eye, and she never once saw her husband. The Duke remained a phantom, his presence felt only in the oppressive atmosphere of the house and the strict, unyielding routine enforced by his housekeeper. Driven by a mixture of boredom and defiance, Genevieve began to test the boundaries of her confinement. She started exploring the vast, labyrinthine manor, memorizing its endless corridors, dusty drawing rooms, and neglected libraries. The West Wing, where her rooms were located, was cold and formal, but the East Wing, the Duke's private domain, was another world entirely. Mrs. Gable had forbidden her from entering it, which naturally made it her primary destination. One afternoon, when she was certain the housekeeper was occupied, Genevieve slipped into the forbidden territory. The air here was different, heavier with a sense of unspoken grief. The portraits on the walls were more recent, depicting a handsome, smiling man and a beautiful, kind-eyed woman, Caspian's parents, the previous Duke and Duchess. She found their story in a leather-bound family history in the library. A tragic carriage accident a decade prior had claimed both their lives, leaving a 20-year-old Caspian to inherit the title and its immense responsibilities. Further down the hall, she came to a set of doors that were locked. A faint scent of lavender and dried roses emanated from within. She pressed her ear to the cold wood and could hear nothing but the mournful sigh of the wind outside. These rooms felt different, sealed away like a tomb. This, she sensed, was the heart of the house's sorrow. Her solitary explorations were interrupted by the announcement of a visitor. A note was delivered to her room on a silver tray, informing her that Lord Marcus Harrington, her husband's cousin, would be arriving to pay his respects. Lord Harrington was the opposite of the Duke in every conceivable way. Where Caspian was dark and severe, Marcus was fair and charming, with a ready smile and eyes that sparkled with easy warmth. He arrived with a bouquet of flowers for Genevieve, expressing his delight at finally meeting the woman who had tamed the beast of Blackwood. "I must confess, we were all shocked," he said, taking a seat in her parlour, his demeanour relaxed and friendly. "Caspian has never shown the slightest interest in marriage. You must be a remarkable woman indeed, Your Grace." Genevieve offered a polite, non-committal smile. "The Duke is a man of surprises." Marcus laughed. "That's one word for it. He's a hard man, my cousin. Has been ever since the accident. He locked everything away, his heart, his memories, this entire wing of the house." He gestured vaguely towards the East Wing. "He can be ruthless. I hope he is treating you well." The question was posed with such sincere concern that Genevieve found herself almost wanting to confide in him. He seemed like an ally in this cold, hostile place. "He is distant," she admitted carefully. Marcus's expression grew serious. "Be careful, Genevieve. May I call you Genevieve? My cousin is a man of secrets. He inherited a title, yes, but also a mountain of debt his father had accrued. Caspian saved this estate through sheer, brutal force of will. He crushed his competitors, made enemies of everyone. He does nothing without a motive. I only hope his motive for marrying you was a noble one." The insinuation hung in the air between them. He was planting a seed of doubt, suggesting that her marriage was not just a whim, but part of a calculated, perhaps nefarious, plan. Over the next few days, Lord Harrington was a constant, welcome presence. He walked with her in the neglected gardens, told her amusing stories of London society, and filled the oppressive silence of the manor with his easy laughter. He was a breath of fresh air, a glimpse of the world she had lost. But the more time she spent with him, the more a tiny, unsettling feeling began to grow in the back of her mind. His questions about the estate's finances were a little too pointed, his sympathy a little too polished. One evening, as she was wandering the library, she pulled down a heavy, leather-bound ledger from a high shelf. It was dated from the year after Caspian's parents had died. Curious, she opened it. Inside were pages and pages of meticulous accounts, all in the Duke's sharp, decisive handwriting. She saw records of land sold, assets liquidated, and debts paid. It painted a picture not of a ruthless predator, as Marcus had implied, but of a desperate young man fighting to save his family's legacy. She flipped further, to more recent years. Here the entries were different. There were large, regular payments made out to various accounts she didn't recognize, and notations of loans given to agricultural tenants that seemed to far exceed their need. Something was wrong. There were discrepancies, figures that didn't add up, and several of the largest payments were co-signed by one Lord Marcus Harrington, who, according to a notation, held a position of financial oversight granted by the late Duke. A cold dread washed over her. Marcus's charm suddenly seemed like a mask, his concern a lie. He hadn't been warning her about Caspian. He had been probing for weaknesses, trying to gauge how much she knew. The whispers in the walls of Thorne Manor were not just of sorrow, but of deceit. And she was standing right in the middle of it. The discovery in the ledgers changed everything. Genevieve was no longer a frightened prisoner waiting for her fate to be decided. She was a player in a game she was only just beginning to understand. The pity she had felt for herself curdled into a cold, focused anger. She had been used by Caspian, yes, but she was also being manipulated by Marcus, and she would be a victim to neither. That evening, she did something she had never done before. She walked to the east wing, to the door of the Duke's private study, and knocked. There was a long silence, and then a curt, "Enter." Caspian was seated behind a massive mahogany desk, awash in the golden glow of a single lamp. The room was lined with books, maps, and geological surveys. He looked up from his papers, his expression a mixture of surprise and annoyance at her intrusion. "I am occupied," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And I am your wife," Genevieve countered, stepping fully into the room and closing the door behind her. She placed the heavy ledger on his desk with a solid thud. "And the duchess of this estate, an estate which, I believe, is being systematically robbed by your cousin." Caspian's eyes narrowed. He looked from her determined face down to the open ledger. For a moment, he said nothing, his gaze fixed on the figures she had circled. The silence was thick with unspoken tension. "You have been busy," he finally stated, his voice flat. It was not a question. "I have been bored," she retorted. "And I am not unintelligent. These payments to the Blackwood Agricultural Fund, they are a fiction, are they not? The fund doesn't exist. And these sums signed for by Lord Harrington, they are exorbitant." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He was not angry, as she had expected. He was appraising her, as if seeing her for the first time. Lord Harrington has managed a portion of the estate's investments since my father's time, he said slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. He has a certain autonomy. He is a thief, Genevieve stated plainly. And a liar. He has spent the last week filling my head with stories of your cruelty, all while, I suspect, lining his pockets with your money. He warned me that you do nothing without a motive. So I must ask, Your Grace, what was your motive in marrying me? Why did you trap a complete stranger in this arrangement? It was the question that had haunted her since the masquerade ball. This time she would not be dismissed. Caspian rose from his chair and walked to the window, staring out into the blackness. When he spoke, his voice was low, devoid of its usual icy command. My father's will contained a clause, he began, his back still to her. A foolish, sentimental addition. He stipulated that should I remain unmarried by my 30th birthday, control of the family trust, the very heart of the Blackwood fortune, would pass to a board of trustees, a board to be chaired by the next male heir in line. Marcus, Genevieve breathed, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. Marcus, Caspian confirmed, turning to face her. He has been waiting, patiently, for years. My birthday is in 2 months. He knew I had no intention of marrying. He has been bleeding the estate dry in small increments, assuming he would soon have control of it all. But lately, he has grown greedy, reckless. I knew he was stealing, but I couldn't prove it without alerting him and giving him time to cover his tracks. I needed to secure the inheritance first. I needed a wife. Immediately. Genevieve stared at him, her mind racing. So you went to the ball, looking for any debutante foolish enough to fall into your trap? Not just any, he corrected, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. I had been watching you all season. You were different, intelligent, spirited. You were not like the others. You were not a simpering fool who would be easily manipulated by Marcus, nor were you a hardened social climber. When you approached me, you simply accelerated my plans. The confession was brutal in its honesty. She was a tool, a means to an end, chosen for her specific qualities like a farmer choosing a broodmare. And yet, beneath the sting of that truth, another feeling emerged, a grudging respect. He had been fighting a silent, desperate war, and she had just stumbled onto the battlefield. So what happens now? She asked, her voice quiet but firm. You have your wife. The inheritance is safe. Will you expose him? Exposing him is not enough, Caspian said, his voice turning hard as steel. I will not just stop him. I will ruin him. I will take back every penny he has stolen and see him left with nothing. But to do that, I need incontrovertible proof. I need him to overplay his hand. In that moment, Genevieve made a choice. She would not be a passive pawn in his war. She would be his queen. Then let us set a trap for him, she said, her voice ringing with newfound purpose. He thinks I am your weakness, a lonely, naive girl he can use against you. Let us use that to our advantage. He wants information. I will feed him lies. He wants an ally. I will be his confidant. We will make him believe he is winning, right up until the moment the door slams shut. Caspian looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time since she had met him, she did not see the Iron Duke. She saw a man who had carried an impossible burden alone for a decade, and in his eyes she saw not the cold indifference of a captor, but the dawning recognition of an equal. It would be dangerous, he warned. My life has been nothing but danger since I met you, Your Grace, Genevieve replied, a small, wry smile touching her lips. I am beginning to grow accustomed to it." The plan they devised was a tapestry of deceit, woven with Genevieve's newfound cunning and Caspian's ruthless strategy. Genevieve transformed herself, playing the part of the neglected, resentful wife to perfection. She complained to Marcus about Caspian's coldness, his long hours locked in his study. She let slip carefully crafted pieces of misinformation that Caspian was on the verge of financial collapse, that he was planning to sell off a large, unentailed portion of the estate to cover phantom debts. Marcus, blinded by his greed and arrogance, swallowed every lie. He saw Genevieve as his key, his unwitting spy inside the fortress. He became bolder, his visits more frequent, his questions more invasive. He offered her a way out, promising to help her secure a comfortable future for herself, once Caspian was inevitably ruined, and he, Marcus, took control. The final act was set for a grand dinner party at Thorne Manor. It was the first time the house had been open to guests since Caspian had inherited the title. Invitations were sent to a select group of the most influential figures in London finance and society, including the family solicitor, Mr. Davies, and several prominent members of the House of Lords. The official reason was to formally introduce the new Duchess. The real reason was to serve as a stage for Marcus Harrington's public immolation. Genevieve played her role flawlessly. She greeted Marcus with a secret, conspiratorial smile, whispering to him that Caspian was meeting with his bankers that very night to sign the papers for the land sale. "He is desperate," she murmured. "He's putting the Blackwood mines up as collateral. If you are ever going to act, it must be tonight." This was the bait. The Blackwood mines were the most profitable asset in the entire duchy, and the lie that they were at risk was designed to provoke Marcus into a final, reckless move. As the dinner progressed, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Caspian was a cool, commanding host, while Genevieve radiated a nervous energy that everyone attributed to a new bride's anxiety. After the main course, Marcus, flushed with wine and impending victory, rose to his feet, tapping his glass for attention. "My lords, esteemed guests," he began, his voice smooth and confident. "It is a joy to be here to celebrate my cousin and his lovely new bride. However, I stand before you tonight with a heavy heart. As some of you know, my late uncle, in his wisdom, entrusted me with a degree of oversight in the family's financial affairs." He cast a look of feigned sympathy at Caspian. "It is therefore my unfortunate duty to report that this estate is in dire peril. My cousin's mismanagement has brought this great family to the brink of ruin. He is, even as we speak, preparing to sign away the Blackwood mines, the bedrock of this duchy, in a desperate and foolish gamble." A wave of shocked murmurs swept through the dining room. "I cannot, in good conscience, stand by and watch my family's legacy be destroyed," Marcus continued, his voice ringing with false righteousness. "Therefore, I have taken the necessary steps. With the evidence of insolvency I have gathered, I have petitioned the courts to have Caspian declared incompetent. I, as the next in line, and as the chair of the trust, will be assuming control of the estate to rescue it from this disaster." He produced a sheaf of papers from his coat pocket and slammed them on the table. "It is done. By morning, I will be the master of Thorne Manor." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stood, beaming, triumphant. It was Caspian who broke it. He did not look angry. He looked bored. "A compelling performance, cousin," he said, his voice dangerously calm. He rose slowly from his chair at the head of the table. "There is, however, one small flaw in your dramatic tale. I have not been meeting with bankers. I have been meeting with these gentlemen." He gestured to a side door, which opened to reveal two stern-faced men in plain clothes, officers from Scotland Yard. Marcus's face went white. "What is the meaning of this?" "The meaning," Caspian said, "is that every conversation you have had with my wife for the past month has been overheard by witnesses. Every piece of advice you have given her, every document you have encouraged her to procure from my study, has been a carefully placed piece of a trap." Genevieve stood up, her expression no longer that of a frightened girl, but of a triumphant duchess. "You told me the Duke was selling the mines, Lord Harrington. I have your signed letters right here, advising me to secure my future by helping you. Furthermore," Caspian continued, his voice like the crack of a whip, "Mr. Davies, our solicitor, has spent the last month conducting a full audit of the accounts you have managed. He has found evidence of embezzlement stretching back nearly a decade, totaling a sum that would be quite startling to the courts." Mr. Davies, a small, grim-faced man, nodded. "The evidence is irrefutable, Lord Harrington." Marcus stared around the room, his eyes wide with panic. He looked from Caspian's cold, victorious face to Genevieve's unyielding gaze. He saw no allies, only judges. The trap had not just been sprung. It had pulverized him. "You!" he snarled at Genevieve, his mask of charm finally shattering to reveal the desperate rat beneath. "You did this." "No, Marcus," Caspian corrected him, stepping to stand beside Genevieve, placing a protective hand on her back. "We did this." The officers stepped forward, and the public humiliation of Lord Marcus Harrington was complete. He was escorted from the room, his grand ambitions reduced to a pathetic, ignominious exit. The unmasking was over. The battle for Thorne Manor had been won. In the aftermath of the dinner party, a profound quiet settled over Thorne Manor. It was not the oppressive, sorrowful silence of before, but a calm, peaceful stillness. With Marcus Harrington's treachery exposed and his threat neutralized, the dark cloud that had hung over the estate for a decade finally dissipated. Genevieve and Caspian stood in the grand, empty ballroom, the scene of Marcus's downfall. The candles had been extinguished, and the room was bathed in the soft, ethereal light of the moon streaming through the tall arched windows. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The events of the evening, the culmination of weeks of shared secrets and dangerous planning, hung in the air between them. Finally, Caspian turned to her. The severity was gone from his face, replaced by an expression of unguarded vulnerability she had never seen before. "He is gone," Caspian said, his voice quiet. "The trust is secure. My father's will is fulfilled. The reason for our arrangement is now concluded." Genevieve's heart clenched. She understood his meaning perfectly. Their marriage had been a contract, a business deal. The terms had been met, the objective achieved. Logically, their partnership was over. She was free. She could leave this cold, imposing house and the cold, imposing man who had forced her into this life. She could return to London and, despite the scandal, attempt to rebuild some semblance of her old life. But the thought of leaving brought her no joy. It brought only a sharp, aching emptiness. In the crucible of their shared deception, something unexpected had been forged. She had come to see the man behind the fearsome reputation, a man burdened by duty, fiercely protective of his legacy, and capable of a trust so profound he had placed his entire future in her hands. She had come to respect him, and, to her own astonishment, she had come to care for him. "So I am no longer needed," she stated, her voice carefully neutral, betraying none of the turmoil in her heart. "I suppose I should have my things packed." He took a step closer, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something that looked like fear in his cool grey eyes. "Genevieve," he said, her name a soft plea. "That is not what I meant. The foundation of our marriage was a lie, a necessity, a trap. I gave you no choice. I bound you to me for my own selfish reasons. You have every right to despise me for that." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "But I find that I cannot bear the thought of you leaving." He reached out, not with the possessive grip she remembered from their first dance, but with a hesitant, gentle touch, his fingers brushing against hers. "Everything we have done these past weeks, working together, trusting one another, it became more than a strategy, at least for me." He took her hand fully in his. "I know I have no right to ask anything more of you, but I am asking nonetheless. Stay. Not as part of a bargain, not as the Duchess of Blackwood, but as my wife, as Genevieve." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a profound, overwhelming relief. "You never did give me a proper waltz, you know," she whispered, a tremulous smile touching her lips. "The first one was a declaration of war." A slow, genuine smile spread across Caspian's face, a sight so rare and transformative it took her breath away. It reached his eyes, chasing away the last of the shadows. "Then allow me to rectify that," he murmured. He drew her into his arms in the center of the moonlit ballroom. There was no orchestra, no audience, only the silent, watchful portraits of his ancestors on the walls. He began to hum, a soft, low melody, and led her into a slow, graceful waltz. This dance was nothing like the first. His hold was not a capture, but an embrace. His eyes were not cold and calculating, but warm and full of an emotion she now recognized as love. In the silent heart of Thorne Manor, the ruthless Duke and his unwilling bride danced, not as adversaries, but as partners. The game was over. The forced bargain was void. And in its place, something real and beautiful had just begun. The second waltz was not an ending, but a true beginning. And so, the tale of the ruthless Duke and the debutante's wager comes to a close. What began as a foolish game in a gilded ballroom transformed into a battle of wits, a dangerous alliance, and ultimately, a love story no one could have predicted. Genevieve Ainsworth, who sought only to win a dance, found herself winning a duke's guarded heart. And Caspian Thorn, who thought he was capturing a pawn, discovered he had found his queen. Their story reminds us that sometimes the most unexpected circumstances can lead to the most profound connections, and that behind even the most fearsome facades, a heart can be waiting to be won. It proves that a partnership built on trust and respect is a foundation stronger than any contract. What did you think of Genevieve's courage and Caspian's transformation? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of drama, intrigue, and romance, please don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, share it with a friend who loves a good historical tale, and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this one. Click the notification bell so you never miss an update.